going to let a few more folks roll in and then we'll get started shortly. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, Mickey, we're good on.
Get started?
Mm-hmm.
Let's do it.
Okay. So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our first interview in our Free the Fresno Elephants Zoom interview series. And we're so lucky and excited to have Dr. Keith Lindsay joining us here today. Most of you probably know me, but I'll do a quick introduction. My name is Courtney Fern. I'm the NhRP's Director of Government Relations and Campaigns, and I am zooming in from California. We're, like I said, so honored to have Dr. Keith Lindsay. I'm going to read a little bit of his bio and then turn it over to him to give a brief introduction, because I'm sure I'm not going to be able to cover the extent of his work and his expertise in elephants, but here we go. Dr. Keith Lindsay is a biologist with more than 30 years of experience in elephant research and conservation. Dr. Lindsay's work began in 1977 in Kenya's Amboseli National Park, the top place in Africa to get close to free-ranging elephants. There, he began researching wild elephants with Amboseli Trust for Elephants, now the longest-running study of elephant behavior in the wild. From then on, Dr. Lindsay's professional work with elephants expanded to other parts of Africa, Asia, and North America. And Dr. Lindsay is also an expert in our case on behalf of elephants Amale, Nalwazi, and Vasmusi, who are imprisoned at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. So I will turn it over to Keith to give maybe a brief overview of his work with elephants, and maybe also touch upon what piqued his interest in elephants and how he got into research.
Thank you, Courtney, for the opportunity to talk to you and to so many people. It's great to see the participation. Yeah, an interest in the elephants. My interest in elephants, I mean, I was very lucky back in the late 70s. So there you go. That gives you a hint of my longevity. I was backpacking across Africa, but I had some contact details of some people in Kenya, and they led me to a gentleman called Harvey Crows and Cynthia Moss, who were starting a study at that time. They were a few years into it, getting going, and I was really in the ground floor of their project, and it was to study. They had this vision of studying elephants using recognition files of all the elephants in the population. It had been started before in Tanzania by a man called Ian Douglas Hamilton, and he's gone on to found an organization called Save the Elephants, which is also working in Kenya. But he had to leave Tanzania and his work was interrupted, whereas Cynthia Moss particularly started this project in Amboseli, and she did it there because it's a small park in the southern part of Kenya, just across the border from the Mount Kilimanjaro in Tanzania, and that watershed feeds the ecosystem. It provides all the water for the springs that come out, and that's the source of the water for the whole system of grazing animals, including elephants. It was quite a well-used park, and for that reason the elephants were very used to people in vehicles, and there was also a small number of about 400, and so that allowed them to quickly photograph them, and they discovered that the ears of the elephants were very easily distinguishable with the nicks and tears and things on the sides, and also that once you've got a few family members, you could then figure out the rest of them. So they assembled a catalog of photographic file of the elephants at that time and all the babies, and they gave them names from a baby book. Yeah, I was involved from quite early on. They were studying social behavior. The interest there was mainly the society of elephants, and so there was a niche for me to study the feeding ecology and and foraging of the elephants. And so that's what I got involved in, and I did that for a master's in Canada, and then where I'm from, and then from I was able to do a PhD in Cambridge in UK on the same subject. And that ended around the mid 80s, the actual field work, but then I've remained in contact with the project ever since, and have been on and off involved in supervising and helping design research and keeping the research going. And it's been going ever since then. As Courtney mentioned, the longest running study now. And so now there's just shy of 2,000 elephants there. All the births and deaths have been recorded to within a month of occurrence, certainly the births. So that means that the genealogies of all the elephants in the whole population are known. The other thing is that because they're so habituated to people, they're really easy to observe. And so you could quickly, from my perspective, watch every item that they fed on, but also where they went. And people studying the social behavior were able to find out incredible, intricate details of their social behavior. And it quickly became clear that these are amazing animals. And so for the sort of technical reasons of why it was a great place to study elephants, it became for me a kind of a lifelong passion, because they're clearly highly intelligent, powerful, but yet incredibly gentle with each other, and very tolerant of people, despite the conflicts they sometimes get into. But they're just wonderful animals. So I have remained in contact with the project, and yeah, that was a long time ago now. It's in its 50th year. I wasn't involved quite that long, but certainly over 40 years now. And but then subsequently, I went on to do work in other parts of Africa on humans' relations with wildlife in general, and different species of wildlife, but keeping the focus on elephants. And then in the past few years, I've gotten involved with elephants in captivity, and I've done a number of statements and comments on captive elephants in different situations in zoos, mostly in North America. I did a survey of these elephants in zoos in Japan a few years ago. And then I've also been involved in elephants in relation to their international trade in live elephants to zoos, but also the ivory trade. So that's pretty much it. Sorry for going on, but there it goes.
Yeah, no, it doesn't sound like you've been doing much. So, but that's amazing. All the work that you've done. And yeah, I'm happy that you mentioned elephants in Japan, because the welfare assessment, if anyone's interested, we could send around a link. It was incredible. And what's the solitary elephants there, and the sort of barren environments that they're kept in. It's really outrageous. And what you put together and what you worked on with Ulara was great. And I encourage anyone to follow them as well. But let's talk a bit about what you learned about who elephants are during your study or during your research, and just your work on behalf of elephants. I was wondering if you could give maybe a brief overview. And I know it's easier said, you can't really say what's a typical day of an elephant, because it likely probably depends on where they are in their lives, their age, if there's some sort of conflict going on. But a lot of our work, we talk about, how the zoos don't meet the needs of the elephants. So before going into that, I thought it might be good to go over like a very standard day of an adult female and an adult male African elephant, if you wouldn't mind.
Thanks again.
In the wild.
In the wild. Yeah, I must say, I apologize in advance if I tend to go on and on, but once I get started talking about elephants, it's hard to get me to stop. I'll try to be brief. A typical day for an elephant, I mean, as you said, there aren't really typical days, they're all different in the wild, but the basic characteristics are that they have, being the largest land mammal, land animal, really, African elephants, possibly, well, apart from dinosaurs, certainly the largest existing mammal animals, and they're herbivores, so they have to get all their food from plants. And that means that they have to spend a lot of time feeding. And most of the plants out in the environment are not high quality. The plant material, there's lots of fruits and things here and there, but mostly it's low quality food. So they have to make a living by finding large amounts of food. That means they spend something like 3/4 of their time in the 24 hours feeding. And when I studied them, I had plenty of time to do my work. In fact, I did a few follows over 24 hours, and they are feeding actively during the night and during the daytime. So that's what they do. Most of the time, they're feeding on different kinds of plants, mostly grasses when available, because they're easy to get and they can feed large amounts, but if it's good enough quality. But they also eat a whole range of other plants. In fact, just about everything. They eat the roots of trees. They certainly will find fruits if they can. They love fruits, especially forest elephants. But they aren't very abundant, so they'll eat flowers, they'll eat vines, they'll pull them down. They eat everything basically in the wild. And so they have a huge varied diet, and they spend a lot of time feeding. The rest of their day, they spend a few hours usually in the middle of the day, heat of the day, sleeping, often standing up when they're adults. At night, they spend a couple or more hours sleeping, lying down, right on their sides, snoring away. It's quite hard to keep awake when you're surrounded by elephants snoring. But then they lurch to their feet and start again with feeding. The other things they do, they take care of their bodies by wallowing, by dusting, scratching. They use branches as fly whisks and to remove ticks and things. They drink once a day generally. They're on the move all the time, basically, and they move slowly when feeding, steadily across grass, but then when they're moving between feeding areas, they move purposefully, great long strides, and they do that every day as well. And there's usually a period in the morning and the evening when they go walking, and then when they're not doing all these other things, they spend. So most of the time they're doing these other things, and they spend time socializing. And indeed, when they're feeding, they're also interacting and talking to each other all the time. But then when they're actively socializing, they touch each other. They are friendly to each other. They sometimes are aggressive to strangers. So that's the kind of general picture of the life. Now, females, they have a whole suite of behaviors that are specific to females, and the females live with other generally related females, so they stay together with their sisters and their mothers and their aunts, and all these related females stay together for their whole lives until the groups get very large, and then they split up along kind of lines of mother and offspring. That's savanna elephants. Forest elephants and Asian elephants tend to have smaller groups and mostly just mothers and immediate offspring. But they spend a lot of time taking care of calves, and older animals that are not yet having their own calves can take care of the babies as well, and that's called allo mothering. So they learn mothering skills by play mothering. Play, I mentioned play, they play a lot, especially the babies, the calves. And so there's all sorts of activity like that going on within the group. They can join into bigger aggregations of families, and there are related families. They communicate a lot to each other through low frequency sound and even seismic. They can pick up vibrations that carry under the ground or along the ground for some distance. And studies that in Amboseli and in other places have shown that they are able to recognize individually the calls of over 100 different elephants. So they know a lot about the other animals in their groups and they share the ecosystem with. They also know a huge amount about where food is found, and their spatial memory is enormous. The part of their brain that's associated with spatial memory, the cerebellum, is enormous, as is the motor area of their brain, where used for the trunk. It controls the trunk with all its different muscles. It's a hand as well as a smelling and tasting organ all at once. And so they use that in their feeding. All these different kinds of food that they find. The males will start separating from their mom at a very early age. Even when they're a calf, the boys play away from the girls and away from their family more. But by the time they're in their teens, they really start moving away from the family entirely, and when they join other groups, they spend time with other animals. And then eventually they leave the family entirely and they spend their time with other males, and the males have a separate life from females. But they continue to associate with females from time to time, with family groups. And it's known that young males from a family will come back to their own family, be greeted. They know who that guy is, and he knows who they are, and then they go off again. And then when they're very old, the biggest bulls don't spend much time with the females at all, unless they're interested in mating. And then there's that whole side of mating that they do as well, searching for mates and competing. And so the life that they lead is extremely rich, very social, very on the move all the time, covering large distances, large areas, seasonally changing all the time. It's constantly dynamic, and it's fascinating.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it makes me sad hearing about that, because the aspect of the work we do is working on behalf of elephants who are deprived of the ability to engage in any of that behavior you just described, and confined to small, barren, zoo exhibits that maybe at most are, 4 or 5 acres that they have to share with other elephants. So sort of getting to that, US zoos, and I know that's also a general term because some zoo exhibits vary, but generally they claim that they can meet the physical and psychological needs of elephants. And I'm curious what you think of that claim based on the zoo's exhibits that you've seen here in the United States.
Well, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to learn that I don't think that they're anything like what an elephant needs. And it's not just the zoos I've seen, and I've seen some pretty terrible zoos, as well as some that are supposed to be better zoos. And that's a term that's often used, better zoos. And then there's the whole question of the standards, that the AZA, American Zoo Association, has standards for elephants, and other zoo associations in Europe and elsewhere have standards, and they're minimum standards, and they're on the level of a few 100 square meters. They have one thing. There are the compounds, but there are the stalls where they're kept. Often, just about every zoo keeps their elephants in at night in the stall, and in places where the weather's cold, they keep them in there 24 hours. So that's just an area that's slightly larger than the elephant. It's like a shoebox that's a bit on the loose side for the shoe. The outdoor areas, just a few acres. I mentioned that the elephants cover large areas. We're talking tens of thousands of square kilometers in some cases, certainly hundreds. In Asian elephants and forest elephants, the ranges might be smaller, but it's still hundreds of square kilometers or miles for American audience. But we're talking vastly higher orders of magnitude area. The zoo exhibits are completely undersized for an animal like an elephant, but also barren in general terms, partly because they have to keep them clean, but also elephants just walking around a place and you see a zoo exhibit that's been prepared for elephants and it's covered with lush grass. And as soon as elephants spend any time at all in there, there's no more grass. So they're generally barren and uninteresting and unstimulating for their minds and also their bodies. They don't get any exercise, so their muscle tone suffers greatly. But I may be jumping ahead in terms of
Yeah. Oh, no, that's totally fine. No, something you mentioned, and we'll go into it later, but you talked about how the males, once they separate off from the females, or the female herds, they'll often come back to their familial herd and, say hello or socialize. And it makes me think of a smoothie who's, and I know this is maybe like completely unrelated, but his mother is in San Diego, which is only a couple hundred miles from him. So hypothetically, say he was free ranging in California, which we know is not possible. It's sad to think that, both of them are imprisoned at different zoos. His mom's at the San Diego Zoo Safari Park. He's at the Fresno Chaffee Zoo. But, if he was allowed, he could go and visit her and his brothers down there. It's just, I don't know, just what's happening is it's so sad and unnecessary. And I wanted to also talk about the difference between zoos and sanctuaries, because one of the things in our cases we argue, obviously for the elephants to have the right to liberty recognized and for them to be sent to an accredited elephant sanctuary where they can live as freely as possible and enjoy their autonomy to the greatest extent possible. Sometimes the zoos will say, well, sanctuaries are just another form of captivity, which they are, but they're very different. The sanctuaries that you've visited, what's the difference that you've seen between zoos and sanctuaries? And what do you think the quality of life is, the difference of quality of life for the elephants who are imprisoned at zoos versus living freely at a sanctuary, say like Paws or the Elephant Sanctuary in Tennessee?
Well, I think jumping back a little bit to your previous question, do zoos provide for the physical needs of elephants? They don't in any sense, because they can't move around and they can't exercise. And I think that's one of the major differences between zoos and sanctuaries is the scale. Sanctuaries are 2 or 3 orders of magnitude. Generally, the compounds the elephants have are much larger than a zoo exhibit. And one must stress that the places where elephants are kept in zoos are exhibits for public viewing. So there's a couple of things about sanctuaries. One is what you can see, and that is that they're generally larger, much larger. They have varied habitat. They have natural grass that elephants can graze and pluck themselves. They have trees, ponds, hills. They have terrain where elephants can actually use their muscles to walk on, and they have enough space to walk straight line distances at different times of day. So one aspect is the size and also the variety of the habitat that the sanctuaries have. They offer so much more physically for elephants, but also for their minds. They can choose to forage on different food types, and they, according to their own terms. And as I mentioned, they spend so much of their time feeding. That's really important part of an elephant's life. So the other thing, though, is what you don't see, and that is that the philosophy of sanctuaries is to give elephants agency, to allow them to make choices, their own choices about what to do with their time. The best sanctuaries don't prescribe what elephants should do at any given time. They allow them to come in and out of barns. They allow them to associate with whom they like within, disease control restrictions. The other thing is that just about every sanctuary person I've talked to is humble about what they offer, they all admit that it's still not good enough. They're still not giving the elephants what they really need, which is the freedom to move across ecosystems and just to associate with other individuals as they choose, to have families, those sorts of things. By definition, sanctuaries are places where elephants go to end their lives, not to breed and create more elephants. You don't find that humility in zoos.
Yeah. Yeah. to say the least, put it nicely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you for describing that. And you put it so much more eloquently than I could have. I've only had the pleasure of visiting one of the elephant sanctuaries in the US, and that was Paws. And I was taken aback by how much, one, I only saw the elephants that chose to come up to the area where guests are. There was no, bringing them to us. And, they're not open to the public. So it's, just the 1 or 2 open houses a day, and just the amount of space that they had, the social opportunities, and like you said, freedom of choice. They can, if they want to go sleep in the barn, they can go sleep in the barn. If they want to forage all night or, sleep outside, they can sleep outside. I know that's true of all the sanctuaries in the US, the elephant sanctuaries. So it's really great that the elephants have an opportunity, those that are held captive here, to go to a sanctuary, and that meets their needs to the greatest extent possible. So I wanted to talk a bit, and I do want to get to, I know, to talk about the Fresno Chaffee Zoo elephants, but, one of the areas that you work on are threats that are facing elephants, and, aiding with their conservation in their natural